The West can't work out what it thinks about China. In the United States, both main parties seem to agree it's an existential threat that needs to be contained. In Europe, we keep switching between paranoia about Chinese espionage and then going to begging for Chinese investment. What politicians on both continents have in common, though, is this. They struggle to move beyond a very superficial understanding of the world's most important rising power. Now, someone who, for a long time now, has been trying to change that is Kaiser Kuo. Kaiser is a Chinese-American musician and journalist who has spent years living between the world's two superpowers. I've been listening to his podcast, Sinica, for almost a decade. It expertly covers Chinese politics, economics, culture, and industry for a Western audience. It's massively helped me increase my understanding of a country that once seemed, I have to say, fairly opaque. Kaiser also worked for Baidu, China's biggest search engine, so has a unique insight into the struggle between US and Chinese tech. In this interview, we discussed the role China plays in the AI arms race and whether China is in any meaningful way communist. But I started by asking him what he thinks is the single most important way that China is misunderstood in the West.
I think it'd be pretty difficult to narrow down to one single way. That's a tough one. I think that if I have just sort of gone to my head, I would say that it's a failure to appreciate the rapidity at which China has advanced. It's this tendency to see China in its moment right now with its gleaming forests of skyscrapers and its amazing high-speed rail, and not to contextualize that, to realize that the advance has been so incredibly fast and headlong. And that's disorienting, I think, not just for Westerners, but for the Chinese people themselves. And I think there's a lack of appreciation for that.
And I suppose, could you expand on that? So I suppose that, what you're speaking to there is just the pace of development. What took sort of a couple of centuries in the West has taken a couple of decades in China. But sort of, what do you think are the implications of that is, or that people in the West need to sort of pay more attention to, let's say?
Yeah, I think there are at least three things that you could draw from that, and that I think will take you pretty far to understand the Chinese mentality. I mean, for one, across 40-odd years, there have been dislocations, there have been, rough spots for sure, 1989, for example, but by and large, most Chinese people would say that they've seen their lives markedly improve. Then that would include the expansion of personal liberties, indeed, which I think a lot of people would probably find surprising. But in these last years, they've seen a government take the country through some very difficult times historically, and has come out largely unscathed. In fact, it has benefited. We've seen, the lifting of 800, whatever number of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and all of that stuff that you've heard. That sounds cliche. I mean, you've heard it so many times, but it's true. It's part of their actual lived experience. And that has given them a kind of confidence in the competence of the state to actually steer the ship. The second thing that it's done, and I think this is really quite important, is that they have seen their lives improve basically rapidly again in lockstep with the improvement of technology. The faster the devices in your pocket, or the faster your bandwidth at home on your computer are, that's corresponded, I think, at a subconscious level with the improvement of life. And so there's this tendency to be less suspicious, I think, of technology and of technological advance. I think maybe third and possibly most importantly, it's just given them a sense of recovery, of dignity that they attribute in part, again, to the state and to its stewardship. And so, that age-old question that many Westerners and especially Americans have about China, which is, why don't you hate your government as much as I think you should? Actually, you can find an answer for that when you consider the rapidity of China's ascent.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's really important. I think sort of when people look at China, they often assume the only way this government could possibly stay in power is if they were, as repressive as sort of one would imagine in 1984. But when you sort of consider the fact that these are people who've gone from, peasants to middle-class university graduates in the space of 40 years, you can see, there's probably a better explanation, a more simple explanation for why this government seems to have a fair degree of legitimacy.
Right. J.D. Vance, of course, still thinks they're all peasants, but...
Of course. Well, this is a great segue because we're going to show a clip of J.D. Vance in a minute.
Favorite.
And also your point about personal liberties having expanded is going to sort of speak to the next couple of clips we're going to show. Because I did want to talk to you about AI. Obviously, China plays a big role in the debate in the West about artificial intelligence. In particular, sort of, I think the companies in Silicon Valley justify going at very fast paces when it comes to development of this, because they say, we need the West to be ahead of China. You can't regulate us too much, otherwise we'll fall behind. And then you have a similar thing with government saying, we need to be at the forefront of AI because otherwise we're going to lose the coming war with China, I suppose. And so I've got two clips that speak to this. So the first is from Dario Amodei, and I want your opinions of them afterwards, of course. So he's the CEO of Anthropic, one of the biggest or one of the sort of most significant of the generative AI companies in the US. And he's talking to a New York Times podcast after DeepSeek had their breakout moment.
Yeah, so I think this is less about commercial competition, right? I worry less about DeepSeek from a commercial competition perspective. I worry more about them from a national competition and national security perspective. I think where I'm coming from here is, we look at the state of the world, and, we have these autocracies like China and Russia. And I've worried, maybe for a decade, that AI could be an engine of autocracy. If you think about repressive governments, the limits to how repressive they can be are generally set by what they can get their enforcers, their human enforcers, to do. But if their enforcers are no longer human, that starts painting some very dark possibilities. And so, this is an area that I'm therefore very concerned about, where, I want to make sure that, liberal democracies have enough leverage and enough advantage in the technology that they can, prevent some of these abuses from happening, and kind of, also prevent our adversaries from putting us in a bad position with respect to the rest of the world, or even threatening our security.
So Dario Amodei is the co-founder of Anthropic. He's worth $1.2 billion because of the share price of Anthropic. And he's telling us the only reason he's concerned about DeepSeek, nothing to do with competition, it's just because he really values freedom. And he's concerned that if sort of China gets ahead on these technologies, then that could be catastrophic. He also said there, didn't he, that the power of an authoritarian government is only limited by the extent to which it can sort of, by the way in which it might be limited in how people are willing to enforce its power. And I suppose that speaks a bit to what you were saying. He seems to think the only reason the Chinese government can remain in power is their repressive force. And I suppose what you're suggesting is it has more to do with what's often called output legitimacy, sort of the fact that people's quality of lives have risen.
That's
I suppose there is potentially a concern, though, with sort of authoritarian governments and AI. How would you respond to Dario Amodei there?
Well, let me just say that, first of all, I am a user of Claude. I think it's a fantastically good LLM. I use it very often, so hats off to you. Dario actually worked for a Chinese internet company, the same one that I did. Interestingly, about a decade ago, he worked for Baidu briefly. And I can't imagine that had anything to do with his change of heart. I find it really interesting that he talks about the time frame as about a decade ago, because I think he exhibits this really sudden change of heart that a lot of Americans had. If you go back to the Arab Spring, or even before, to some of the later color revolutions, if you go back even to the early days of the internet, there was this techno-utopian idea that somehow the internet, and especially the advent of social media, and I think even when we were talking about AI back then, there was this idea that it was somehow emancipatory, that it was going to set people free. This was the big talking point during the later color revolutions. We had Moldova, the first of several, I think, Twitter revolutions, and then the Facebook revolution of Tahrir Square, and then even when Ahmadinejad was reelected in 2009 in Tehran and people took to the streets, We cheerfully, once again slapped the name of an American, social media product onto it and called it the YouTube revolution. And suddenly, around 2015, 2016, we had this massive flip on this. We went from believing that technology was going to be this emancipatory property that had this volition. It wanted to be free, it wanted people to be free, to suddenly thinking that it was like the trusty handmaiden of authoritarian regimes. And we need to really look at, why it is that we have this sudden and quite abrupt change. And it happened, and I think not coincidentally, at the same moment that we suddenly realized that, oh my God, this thing that we've believed all along, that, genuine technological innovation was only possible under auspices of political liberty. Wow, that turns out not to be true. And in fact, China is now this 10-foot tall tech juggernaut, and it's going to eat our lunch. So yeah, we have. This is something that really challenged a lot of very core ideas of American exceptionalism. We're so used to lording it over people in terms of technological innovation. It set off this crisis of confidence, and people like Amade here have been able to sort of milk this. Now, this doesn't start with generative AI either. If you think back to when Facebook saw the rise of TikTok and saw the menace of TikTok, it changed its whole approach. They hired this Republican dirty tricks operator, this PR company. We've seen the book. We know exactly what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to pivot to talk about China all the time, anytime their fundraising is challenged. So we know what they've tried to do now is to sort of introduce a black hat into the narrative and to just make it all about China. And again, it's not just about technology. I mean, we can't build a bridge or a highway or fill potholes in this country without making it some way about beating China. And they're going to be super impressed when they see how well they filled in the potholes on my street.
I suppose, though, to take his point sort of seriously or at face value, what he's suggesting is that because America is a liberal democracy and China is not a liberal democracy, it's an authoritarian state of one form or another, then liberals, I suppose I consider you a liberal, Kaiser, from sort of how you
I am, yeah.
I
consider myself a liberal, absolutely.
So as a liberal, should you prefer that sort of America reaches AGI before the Chinese do?
I'm a liberal, but I'm a liberal who has a pretty good grounding in history and understands that history has a certain inertia, that certain things are possible in given amounts of time. And so I don't hold the same expectations or the same standards when I look at countries across the world. I don't look at Iran and imagine that they might be able to tomorrow suddenly make this leap across this historic chasm and download the apps of Neil Ferguson's, killer apps of liberal democracy and be like us tomorrow, right? It doesn't happen. I have profound admiration for so many of the things that China has achieved, but I think that things do take time, and give them time. I think the great irony is that if you look at the things that have advanced the very causes that we liberals profess, our fundamental individual liberties, freedom of expression, especially in religion, and all those great things, rule of law, those things probably advanced most, if there's one direct foreign influence that's done it, through the introduction of technologies, and often by American companies, Silicon Valley companies, Sand Hill Road venture capital companies that back them up. So the idea that we're now thinking that we ought to deprive China of that, even if you are somebody who wants peaceful evolution for China or whatever, the idea that we ought to try to starve China of key tech inputs to stymie their technological development runs quite counter to that.
I suppose separate from American policy, if we just sort of look at how AI will affect sort of Chinese politics and society. So I take your point that, often sort of the big liberalizing forces in society have been technological development. So the printing press is the most obvious example, right? That empowers people vis-a-vis the state. But one can imagine different technologies having different effects in this regard. And it is quite easy to imagine how artificial intelligence, I actually personally think in America or China, so I don't think there's any sort of system of government which means that we're immune from this. But I do think there is a lot of, I suppose, indications that artificial intelligence could concentrate power as opposed to distribute it. And how do you see that playing out in China? Could that be, I suppose, worrying when it comes to the potential to organize as workers or as ethnic minorities or as people who are opposed to their local government or national government?
Yeah, and I think that there's no question at all that it could certainly make things much more difficult for people who are critical or dissident intellectuals, ethnic minority groups. Absolutely. I mean, it will certainly concentrate power. But interestingly, if you look at the major AI players in the world right now, one of them has made substantial advances in the regulation of generative AI that has made it obligatory for companies that are doing generative AI to actually register their algorithms, the generative AI algorithms. And there is, in fact, a gigantic database of them that it's open to the public right now that as of April had something like 3,793 different generative AI algorithms registered with, who registered it, what company, and what it does. It's quite remarkable. I just did a podcast interview last week that will drop next week about this database with a researcher who's worked on it. China, there's no question, it's actually strangely ahead of the US, ahead of the EU in terms of its regulations on AI, and not just generative AI, but also things like deep fakes and things like that. Other forms of AI that are based on earlier technologies like deep learning. I think it's something that, even as we lose sleep worrying that authoritarians will abuse it, the authoritarians also lose sleep worrying that it can be weaponized against them as well. So it definitely cuts both ways. I mean, it's not governments that are alone able to badly abuse the AI or any other technology. I mean, I think for good reason, we all worry about the growing power of surveillance capitalism in this country. So I think we have to be, irrespective of whether it's about governments or big firms, we need to all be vigilant.
Let's go to our next clip. Vice President J.D. Vance, here he's discussing the possibility that super powerful AI could kill us all.
Do you think that the U.S. government is capable in a scenario, again, not like the ultimate Skynet scenario, but just a scenario where AI seems to be getting out of control in some way, of taking a pause? Because for the reasons you've described, the arms race component,
the honest question to that is I don't know, because part of this arms race component is if we take a pause, does the PRC not take a pause? And then we find ourselves, we're all sort of enslaved to PRC mediated AI.
So I suppose the discussion there is about sort of the artificial intelligence arms race. And there are lots of people in the AI sort of safety community suggesting that if we let AI get too powerful before we properly understand it, it could end up doing something really terrible. J.D. Vance is saying, he's sort of saying he accepts that to some degree, but he can't slow down because if America slows down, China will go ahead and then we'll all be enslaved by PRC artificial intelligence. What did you make of that argument from the vice president?
Well, I mean, I think it's richly ironic coming from him, who is already enslaved by Silicon Valley tech bros. But hey, I mean, not to be flippant, but I think that it's funny. He talks about this, PRC AI that's going to enslave us. It's just so ridiculously hyperbolic. And again, it's this old playbook where you have to find this enemy and deepen the moral panic and make it all about competing with China. It's out to get us. I mean, it's frankly preposterous. I read a really interesting piece this morning that was based on an FT. I think it was an FT. A fantastic researcher on Chinese technology policy named Angela Zhang had written a piece about how China actually doesn't seem to be gunning for number one, but rather for the number two spot, that it understands its vulnerability if it's too aggressive in pursuing these things. And so, and then that made a lot of sense to me, and it seems to be, I think, the truth of it as far as I can see it. You paint a target on your back if you move too fast, and they're not stupid. They understand the political climate in the United States right now. They understand that they're seeing a lot of these companies sort of arraying against them, and that's not going to be to their own benefit in the long term. So I think Vance's idea, it's pretty it's funny. It just sort of shows us where we've gotten in this race. I mean, at one point he's using this techno dystopian fear of artificial intelligence, ironically, to justify this completely unfettered, hard charging approach to the development of it. I think that there's an inherent contradiction in that. Either you really think that it's an existential threat and a danger, or you don't. And he's just latched on this convenient excuse of this competition with China to justify what he really believes, which is in the sort of accelerationist approach. Now, I think it's interesting that in China, even though I've just talked about how regulation is so important, one conversation you don't hear happening all the time is this dystopian talk of armies of killer robots and the end of humanity as a result of AGI. It's a very different mentality there, and I think it has to do with what I started off talking about with this sort of lockstep advancement of technology and the betterment of individual lives. They are still very much in what I would call a Star Trek phase, as opposed to the West, where we've entered very clearly into a kind of Black Mirror phase. So I wonder whether that has quite a bit to do with it as well. The makeup of our governments is so very, very different. We are just so dominated here in the United States by people from the legal profession, whereas in China, it's a country sort of by and for the engineer.
I want to take a step back from AI and I suppose go to the other all-powerful technological development, which was social media. Now, I sort of remember in the 2010s, when everyone's first getting their iPhones and social media is being rolled out, there's sort of first of all, the argument that China's going to have to just go along with it. Obviously, there's the Bill Clinton argument about it's sort of trying to constrain the internet is like trying to hammer jelly to the wall. And China obviously managed to build their firewall very successfully. But where I want to go with this is that a bit later on from that, there was the argument that sort of the real danger is when social media intersects with an authoritarian government like the Chinese that is able to censor what's on there and use it as a sort of organ of population control. And that was the sort of dystopian social media vision. And my impression now is we've sort of flipped to saying that actually it was the liberal democracies and the liberal capitalist systems whereby we left profit as the only thing that regulates social media. And that's what's really screwed up populations, because we've got all of these large corporations whose only motivation has been to steal the attention of our children for as many hours a day as possible. And people are actually starting to look at China and saying, maybe actually social media and authoritarianism was a less toxic combination than liberal capitalism and social media. And because as far as I understand it, in China, there is a more paternalistic sort of idea of what children should be looking at social media. Xi Jinping, as far as I understood, sort of actively discouraged kids from playing computer games all day. And I suppose is the relationship of Chinese kids to social media vis-a-vis or in comparison to the relationship of Western kids to social media, is that something where we can say China's definitely got the better approach there?
I think that they're both approaches are deeply beset with pathologies and things that I find, really morally objectionable, each in their own way. I mean, maybe the answer is that we shouldn't have the damn thing in the first place. But I think that the idea that Chinese social media is lovely, sanitized, full of civil conversations, nobody, using logical fallacies in arguments, God forbid. No, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's woolly, it's wild, it's mean, it's full of cyberbullying, just like everywhere else. It's pretty awful. It's not, as one commentator once said, the spinach version where we get the the candied cereal version in America. No, it's not like that at all. It's pretty awful. Also, it is restrained to some extent. I mean, some of the worst of it is prevented in China. And yeah, you're right. There are a lot of people now sort of looking enviously. We already seem to have adopted this Chinese idea of internet sovereignty, and so even the language that we've used in the former Trump administration talking about clean networks. I mean, that sounded an awful lot like something you might have seen in party propaganda some years ago. So I wonder whether there's a significant difference. I think, a pox on both their houses. I don't like the abuse of social media by authoritarians. I don't like the abuse of social media by the capitalist elites either. I think we're naive to think that this thing was ever not going to be full of trolls and full of spammers and full of bots and all this other stuff, full of disinformation, a conduit for conspiracy theory. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that the grass is not necessarily greener on the Chinese side.
Slightly different topic. Is China meaningfully communist in any way?
So, I mean, China is ruled by a communist party. And I think that what we need to understand, what people I think often fail to understand, is that in the late 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping and people around him, it wasn't just Deng, I think that needs to be reinterpreted, when they talked about the need to introduce the bourgeois mode of production, that they would introduce some elements of capitalism. This was toward this end of sort of backfilling what Marx understood and what Lenin understood as the historical mission of that particular mode of production, which is to create abundance, right? To create material conditions for. I mean, this was still a time where the majority of the Chinese population, by a long shot, was involved in agricultural work. They were not proletarians, and so they decided that we need to do this sort of infill and allow this under the guidance of this vanguard party that understood. I don't think they've ever dropped the idea that eventually those conditions will exist where they can move to a higher stage. But they hit pause. Deng talked about for 50 or 100 years. I have a very strong feeling that there are still people who are ideologically committed to the values of communism. That there are probably people in the bowels of the Chinese Academy of Science who are working on ways to use artificial intelligence to supplant things like the price mechanism of supplant the market in determining prices, to supplant the market in determining resource allocation, wages, and things like that. I think that's kind of pie in the sky right now, but I don't doubt that there are people who are working toward that. So in that sense, yeah, China is still meaningfully communist, but I don't think in a practical sense it is at all. I think that the strange sort of syncretic amalgam of ideological threads that have come together in what they it just rolls so right off the tongue. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. That idea, I mean, it contains elements of Leninism, to be sure, of even Marxism, Leninism, but plenty, ample dollops of just good old fashioned reactive nationalism. Lots and lots of elements of Confucianism, of sort of Singaporean style neo-authoritarian technocracy. Lots of different threads that are pulled together in that, and to try to label it simply as communist is I think deeply, deeply misleading.
And I suppose to talk about the relationship between the state and capital, because I think clearly you do have a more powerful state vis-a-vis capital in China than you do in the West. And my understanding is we've seen some quite impressive examples of this, I suppose, in recent years. So what I'm thinking of is how a couple of years ago, you sort of had the Chinese government saying, our economy is too weighted towards property speculation. And then they kind of intentionally popped the bubble. I think they also, Xi thought that there were too many sort of graduates going into finance, going into consumer tech. And he sort of said, you guys should be doing something more socially useful. And so lots of them went into, the electric car industry or into generative AI. And it does seem like you can have a state which directs capital towards sort of productive activity in a way which sort of in liberal capitalist systems we struggle to do. So we do end up with sort of economies which are very much weighted towards finance and speculation, whereas in China they've managed to avoid that. And I suppose sort of the narrative on this has very much changed in the last few years, because I remember a couple of years ago everyone saying, "Oh, the Chinese economy is a basket case. They've killed the goose that lays the golden eggs." If I've got that phrasing quite right.
Yeah, you did.
I did. That was correct. I always have this moment of self-doubt every time I use an idiom. I just need a bit more confidence. But now people are saying, "Oh, actually, maybe popping that bubble was a good idea." So I suppose can you talk about that relationship between the state and capitalism in China and how it works?
Sure. I mean, like as you say, we in the West have steered away, especially in the United States, out of ideological commitment. We've believed that state intervention of that sort it's not just something that we struggle to do; it's something that we regard as somehow anathema until we didn't. I mean, suddenly, as you say, we're all about industrial policy. Now, to be sure, we've been about industrial policy all along. We've just sort of done it on the sly and not talked about it openly. The strange thing is now we're doing it a little more openly, but without actually having had a national conversation about it. We sort of woke up one morning and realized that, Chips and Science Act, right? Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure Act. And here we are. But we don't have a lot of practice at doing it in this fashion. It's underfunded. And I think most importantly, we don't have something analogous to the party in the U.S. or in any other Western liberal democracy that's capable of that kind of implementation. I recently was asked about this, and I said that there's kind of flippantly, there's a 3-letter answer to how China is able to do that. It's just simply KPIs. If you set expectations for government bureaucrats, the party bureaucrats, all up and down look, the size of the party, it's absolutely enormous. It's close to 100 million people. Now, not all of them are active and are actual or putative holders of political office, but their KPIs matter. They're key performance indicators. If you want to clean up China's rivers, let's appoint a system of people who are ultimately responsible for this and who will be graded on the level of pollutants in rivers across time. And if these go up, then you're not going to get promotion. You're in fact going to be demoted. Your pay might get docked. You might be publicly shamed. If they improve, well, then great. We'll put your picture on billboards and we'll send you on up the ladder of success. The same thing has been done in a lot of other areas. Now, the two things that you mentioned, one of them, steering people away from certain so this is done maybe more through moral suasion and actual incentivization than through just party functionary KPIs, but it operates on basically the same principle. And if you live in a society where the parents look around them and they see that the older children who are getting into Tsinghua and Peking University, or who are going abroad, not that they can anymore now that we've stopped this, but who are going, to Ivy League schools in the United States, or going to Cambridge or to Oxford, they are all studying STEM. The people who are successful entrepreneurs all studied STEM. All the leaders all studied STEM. Well, there's going to be an awful lot of pressure at the sort of nuclear family level to get the kids to follow in that path. It's quite natural that way. And then when you add to that the sort of moral suasion of physicists should be doing physics, and pointing to things like, well, the bane of video games or social media or these complicated financial instruments that are designed by people who are bilking the little family retail investor of their money through this sophisticated algorithmic trading. It's easy to push them away from that. And most importantly, it's because the state can direct capital, as you say. When they set up gigantic funds where there's going to be money in certain industries, whether it's a few years ago in solar and in wind, or there's going to be money now in semiconductor manufacturing, that is where people will gravitate toward. They understand that that's where the favorable winds will be blowing.
And finally, I know you've written and spoken recently about sort of the DeepSeek moment. We talked about it a lot on the show, and sort of the Western world, at least, woke up to the fact that China can innovate when it comes to technology. So there had been this assumption that all they can really do is sort of copy what the Americans are doing. And actually, it seemed like DeepSeek was genuinely a frontier technology when it came to artificial intelligence. I suppose there's a similar story, I think, with BYD. So people were sort of saying, oh, China is never going to be very good at sort of like being an actual competitor when it comes to electric vehicles. They'll always be sort of this cheap alternative. And
right.
Actually now they're now the leading Chinese company. The leading global company when it comes to electric vehicles.
Right. Revenues ahead of Tesla's now. Outselling Tesla in Europe now, right?
Exactly. Well, none of us like Elon Musk anymore, apparently. So that's even he pissed off what would have been his core market, which is sort of liberal people who care about climate change. But anyway, it's
right.
a bit of a side issue there. What I want to ask you is where you think the next DeepSeek moment might come from. What might be the sort of next big thing to come out of China, which will shock the West and will be like, oh God, we didn't realize they could do that. And I don't just mean sort of products. I mean, could it come from culture, diplomacy, military? I mean, what do you think will be the next shock that the West gets about China?
I could probably come up with one in each of these categories, but let's stick with. Well, let's start with technology. I mean, China has made significant advances now in nuclear fusion. They've had this artificial sun project going for quite some time, but recently they've had the longest sustained nuclear reactions. In fact, ones that have generated marginally more energy than was put into them. So that is a breakthrough. We might see something along those lines. They've also made gigantic leaps in quantum computing. They recently announced a cryptography system that's quantum based that they simply say is unbreakable. That no extant computational system could possibly crack the cryptography that's produced by this quantum system. Those are two areas I would look at, but I think maybe in the biosciences is another very, very important area. And again, I think this is Chinese basic research lives in an environment of a lot of development, right? So there's it's not done in the abstract. I think that we will see breakthroughs relative to the United States in large part because the Trump administration is so actively gutting American scientific research. So I think it's likely that we will see things that might have happened in the West earlier now happening in China in the coming years. In the realm of diplomacy, I think we need to be all paying very, very big attention to the Gulf Cooperation Council, and ASEAN and China are currently meeting in Malaysia. I think that we haven't really thought through the ramifications. The United States hasn't not thought through it thoroughly of the so-called Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs and how much we put the fear of God into a lot of our traditional trade partners, and how they're not going to buckle under the American insistence that they simply choose sides, that they're going to hedge. In many cases, they're going to move much closer to China, and we're already seeing this happen in the EU. I mean, much will be seen. I think July, when the EU delegation goes to China, that may produce a lot of additional shock. It shouldn't. I mean, we should have been prepared for this. And then, of course, what's happening with China and many parts of the global South.
Brilliant. I suppose can you give us a hint on what could be the DeepSeek moment when it comes to the military? You said you had something for all those categories. This is the one that probably might be the more worrying.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't. I mean, I think that look, there China has signed on to agreements about the non-use of algorithms of AI in nuclear launch. So that's comforting. But China is modified. I don't want to spoil. Next week I'm going to interview a gentleman who is a leading researcher of Chinese nuclear doctrine, a guy by the name of Zhao Tong, and he's given me a few of his papers, and I've just been going through those, and I think it's going to be in that realm.
Yeah. You can upload it to Claude to get the breakdown. Right. Seeing as you've told us that's your favorite AI model.
It's not my favorite. It's I mean, they're all really. I use a whole bunch of them. I mean, I am not maybe the techno optimism of I am not somebody who hand wrings all day long about AI, and I use it very, very actively in many aspects of my life, particularly in guitar gear. Like, it helped me rewire my Stratocaster recently. It helped me pick the right Celestion speakers for my Marshall cabinet. It's helped me done lots of guitar gear stuff. And it's pretty amazing, ChatGPT on that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I use it all, but I still hand wring about it because I feel like while it's really useful now, it could also get somewhat catastrophic in the near future. Kaiser Kuo, thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, I've really, really got so much from your Sinica podcast over the past few years. So thank you for all of that, and a pleasure to be joined by you on Novara Media.
Really, really great pleasure and an honor to be here.